I was 34 when I finally discovered why my father and his family seemed to hate me my entire life. Growing up, I always felt like an unwanted guest whenever I visited my dad. The cold glances, the awkward silences, the way they would talk around me instead of to me. Recently, I uncovered a dark family secret that explained everything. The discovery was both validating and devastating. Everything I thought I knew about myself and my family changed in an instant. Before I share what I discovered, let me know where you are watching from and hit that subscribe button if you have ever felt like the black sheep in your family. My earliest memories of my father are tainted with a sense of rejection. While most little girls see their daddies as heroes, I learned early on that my father, William Harris, saw me as an obligation rather than a daughter. My name is Lydia, and my mother raised me alone in our small two-bedroom apartment in Portland. We would visit my father every other weekend at the large suburban house he shared with his new wife, Janet, and their children, my half-siblings, Thomas and Abigail. The contrast between how my father treated me versus his other children was painfully obvious even to my young mind. Thomas would run to the door when we arrived, and my father would scoop him up with a booming laugh, tossing him in the air before giving him a bear hug. Abigail would get twirled around like a princess. I would get a stiff pat on the shoulder and a formal, "Hello, Lydia," that sounded more suited to a business meeting than a father greeting his daughter. My 8th birthday remains particularly vivid in my memory. My mother had arranged for my father to pick me up for a special father-daughter birthday lunch. I wore my favorite blue dress with white polka dots and waited by the window for 2 hours, watching every car that drove by, certain the next one would be his. The call eventually came. He had forgotten. He had taken Thomas to a baseball game instead. My mother tried her best to shield me from the rejection. She would make excuses for him, saying things like, "Your dad is just very busy with work," or "He shows love in different ways." But even as a child, I could see the pain in her eyes when she made these excuses, and I knew she was trying to protect me from a truth she herself couldn't bear to acknowledge. The weekend visits to my father's house were exercises in discomfort. Janet, my stepmother, never outright said I was unwelcome, but she had subtle ways of making me feel like an intruder. She would set the dinner table with the family's nice plates and silverware, but my place would have the everyday dishes. She would ask Thomas and Abigail detailed questions about their week, their friends, their activities, and then turn to me with a generic, "And how are you, Lydia?" before moving on, before I could really answer. Thomas and Abigail followed their mother's example. Thomas would hide my belongings during my visits, claiming innocence when I couldn't find my backpack or the book I had brought. Abigail would invite friends over and introduce me as the girl who visits sometimes, rather than as her sister. Small cuts, but they accumulated over time. I tried everything to win my father's approval. I brought home straight A report cards, thinking academic achievement might impress him. I joined the swim team because I had once overheard him mention he swam in high school. I even tried to develop an interest in golf, his weekend passion. Nothing worked. He would glance at my report card and say, "Good job," in the same tone someone might use to acknowledge a stranger holding a door open. He never once came to a swim meet, and when I asked about golf, he said it was his time and changed the subject. Family gatherings were the worst. During holidays at my grandparents' house, the Harris family would cluster together, sharing inside jokes and reminiscing about family vacations I had never been included on. I would hover at the edges, trying to find a moment to join the conversation, feeling like I was auditioning for a part in a play where everyone else already knew their lines. I learned to stay quiet, to be as unobtrusive as possible, because drawing attention to myself usually resulted in awkward silences or thinly veiled annoyance. The question that haunted me throughout my childhood was why? Why did my father even bother with the visitation if he seemed to hate having me around? Why maintain the pretense of being a father when it was clear he wanted nothing to do with me? I got my answer when I was 12. I had gone downstairs for a glass of water late at night during one of my weekend visits and overheard my father talking to Janet in the kitchen. "I am only doing what I have to legally do," he said, his voice tired and irritated. "Sandra insists on these visits and the court mandated it. Trust me, I would rather not deal with any of it." Any childish hope I had been nurturing died that night. I was a legal obligation, nothing more. By the time I turned 15, I had developed a kind of desperate determination to connect with my father's family. Adolescence brought a new perspective on my situation. Maybe I thought I had been too sensitive as a child. Maybe I had misinterpreted their actions. Maybe if I tried harder, they would finally accept me. That Thanksgiving stands out in my memory as the moment I couldn't deny the rejection anymore. My father's extended family had gathered at his house for the holiday. The dining room table was beautifully set with a lace tablecloth fine china and name cards for each person. Everyone in the family had a place at that table except me. A small folding table had been set up in the corner of the living room, visible from the dining room but clearly separate. "We ran out of room at the main table," Janet explained with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. I sat alone at my little table, watching the family laugh and talk together, feeling like a spectator at my own family gathering. My high school graduation should have been a celebration, a milestone my father would want to witness. He had promised to be there. "I will be in the audience, Lydia," he had said during our brief phone conversation when I called to invite him. "Save me a ticket." My mother and I did save him a ticket. We saved one for Janet Thomas and Abigail, too. I scanned the audience before the ceremony looking for them. I kept looking during the speeches. By the time they called my name to receive my diploma, I had stopped looking. They never came. Later, there was a voicemail with a vague excuse about traffic. The constant rejection took its toll. I developed severe anxiety and self-esteem issues. I would overthink every social interaction, convinced that everyone secretly disliked me the way my father and his family seemed to. I became hyper-vigilant about being too much or taking up too much space. If my own father couldn't love me, how could anyone else? Art became my refuge. Photography especially gave me a way to process my feelings and create beauty from pain. Behind the camera, I could control what was seen and what remained hidden. I could create narratives that made sense, unlike the confusing reality of my family situation. My bedroom walls were covered with my photographs, each one a piece of myself I could feel proud of, even if my father never would be. As my high school years progressed, my mother's health began to decline. What started as occasional migraines developed into concerning neurological symptoms that eventually led to a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. Her illness brought us even closer. I became her caretaker in many ways, helping with household tasks she found increasingly difficult. While it was challenging, our bond deepened. She was my rock, and now I had the chance to be hers. It was during my junior year that I met James, my first serious boyfriend. His family was warm and boisterous, his parents interested and engaged in his life. The first time I had dinner with them, his mother asked me questions about my photography and actually listened to the answers. His father joked with me like I was already part of the family. It was a revelation. This was what family dinners could be like. The contrast with my experiences at my father's house was stark and painful. When I was 17, during a particularly difficult weekend visit, I finally gathered the courage to confront my father directly. We were alone in his study, a room I had rarely been allowed to enter. "Dad," I said, my heart pounding, but my voice steadier than I expected. "Why do you hate me?" He looked up from his computer with a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "Don't be so dramatic, Lydia," he said dismissively. "Not everything is about you." But this was about me. It was about his inability to show me the basic affection he so easily gave to his other children. It was about years of subtle and not so subtle rejection that had shaped my entire sense of self. As Thomas and Abigail grew older, their attitude toward me shifted from childish exclusion to more overt hostility. Thomas, 2 years younger than me, would make cutting remarks about my appearance or interests, while Abigail, 4 years my junior, would simply pretend I didn't exist. I remember one particularly painful incident when I discovered Thomas had taken one of my photography portfolios, which I had foolishly brought to show my father, and drawn crude images all over my carefully crafted work. When I confronted him, he smirked and said, "It's not like they were any good anyway." The final straw came when I realized my father had attended every single one of Thomas's football games that season, but couldn't be bothered to come to the student art exhibition where my photograph had won first place. My mother had called to tell him about it to specifically invite him to this one important event. He had said he would try. He didn't even call to say he couldn't make it. As my high school graduation approached and college acceptance letters began to arrive, I made a decision that was both painful and liberating. I would cut contact with my father and his family when I left for college. There was no confrontation, no dramatic declaration. I simply stopped trying. I didn't call, I didn't visit, I didn't send updates about my life. And tellingly, neither did he. College was like stepping into a different world, one where I wasn't defined by being the unwanted daughter. At the University of Washington, I was just Lydia, a freshman with a passion for graphic design and photography. For the first time, I could introduce myself to people who had no preconceived notions about me, no awareness of the family dynamics that had shaped my childhood. I thrived in this new environment. My professors praised my work, and I began to believe that maybe I did have talent. I made friends who actually wanted to spend time with me, who called me just to chat, who remembered my birthday, and celebrated my successes. The constant knot of anxiety I had carried in my chest for as long as I could remember began to loosen. During sophomore year, I met Daniel in a digital media class. He was quiet and thoughtful with a dry sense of humor that made me laugh even on bad days. Unlike James, whose family I had loved more than him, my connection with Daniel was immediate and deep. He listened when I finally opened up about my father not offering platitudes or trying to fix the situation, but simply acknowledging my pain and assuring me it was valid. "Some people aren't capable of being the parents we need," he said one night as we sat on the steps of the library watching the sunset. "But that's about their limitations, not your worth." His kindness was like a balm to old wounds I had almost forgotten were still open. Daniel saw me, all of me, and stayed anyway. With him, I didn't have to be perfect or small or unobtrusive to be accepted. I could be fully myself with all my complexities and insecurities, and he valued me all the more for it. The call about my mother came during my junior year. The MS had progressed more rapidly than her doctors had anticipated, and she had been hospitalized after a severe relapse. I took a leave of absence from school and returned to Portland to care for her. Daniel supported my decision without hesitation, promising to visit whenever he could. Being back in my hometown meant occasional uncomfortable encounters with my father and his family. The hospital was not large, and my mother's extended stay meant running into them was inevitable, especially since my grandmother on my father's side was being treated for heart problems in the same facility. My father seemed genuinely shocked to see me in the hospital cafeteria one afternoon. He had aged in the years since I had last seen him, gray, now prominent in his once dark hair. "Lydia," he said, as if trying to place me. "I didn't know you were back in town." "Mom's been in the hospital for 2 weeks," I replied, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "She has MS." He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I hadn't heard. I'm sorry." The conversation was brief and stilted, neither of us knowing what to say after years of silence. What struck me most was his continued indifference. Even in this family crisis, there was no attempt to bridge the gap between us, no offer of support or help. It was as if we were distant acquaintances who had once known each other rather than father and daughter. Despite the challenges of caring for my mother while trying to continue my studies remotely, those months were precious. We talked more openly than we ever had before. She shared stories from her youth, her dreams for me, her regrets. The one subject she avoided was my father. Whenever I tried to bring him up to understand what had happened between them, she would change the subject or claim to be too tired to discuss it. Daniel proposed the following spring on a rare weekend when he had convinced me to let him take me away from caregiving responsibilities. My mother's condition had stabilized, and her sister had come to stay with her. We went to the coast, and as we walked along the shoreline at sunset, he knelt in the sand and asked me to be his wife. We planned a small wedding for the fall, hoping my mother would be well enough to attend. I sent my father an invitation more out of a sense of obligation than any real desire to have him there. To my surprise, he did attend, though he came alone and stayed only for the ceremony and a brief appearance at the reception. He gave me an envelope containing a check for $500, the exact same amount I later learned he had given to a distant cousin for her wedding the month before. After the wedding, Daniel and I moved back to Seattle, where I completed my degree and began building my career as a graphic designer. I found work at a small but growing advertising agency where my skills were valued and my creativity encouraged. Daniel finished his master's degree in software engineering and landed a job at a tech startup. We bought a small house, adopted a rescue dog named Luna, and created a life together that was stable, loving, and full of possibility. I made friends at work, genuine connections that expanded into a chosen family of people who cared for each other. We had game nights and backyard barbecues, celebrated holidays together, and supported each other through life's challenges. These relationships helped me understand what healthy connections looked like, how people who care about each other behave. Yet despite the happiness I had found, the wounds of my childhood continued to affect me. I would panic if I thought I had disappointed someone. I would apologize excessively for minor mistakes. I would assume people were angry with me when they were simply quiet or distracted. Recognizing these patterns, I finally decided to start therapy to work through my childhood trauma. My therapist, Dr. Winters, helped me understand how my father's rejection had shaped my self-perception and relationships. Children naturally blame themselves when parents withdraw love, she explained. They believe if they were somehow better, more perfect, the parent would love them. But the truth is, when parents reject their children, it's almost always about the parent's own issues, not the child's worth. Those sessions were painful but illuminating. I began to see that my father's coldness was not a reflection of my value as a person, but a symptom of whatever was broken inside him. This understanding didn't erase the hurt, but it helped me carry it differently. My mother's health continued to decline over the next few years. By the time I was 28, she needed full-time care, and we moved her to a facility near our home in Seattle. I visited her daily, bringing fresh flowers for her room and sitting with her for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes just being present together. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, as autumn light filtered through her window, that she took my hand and said in a voice that was weaker but still determined, "There's something you should know about your father, Lydia. Something I should have told you long ago." Before she could continue, her nurse came in to administer medication, and my mother drifted into sleep. I left with her words echoing in my mind, wondering what revelation she had been about to share. I never got the chance to find out. She suffered a severe stroke that night and passed away 3 days later without regaining consciousness. The funeral was held on a rainy day in October, the kind of soft, persistent rain that seems to mirror grief itself. My mother had been beloved by many, her kindness touching lives even as her own body failed her. The chapel was filled with friends, former colleagues, and relatives from her side of the family. My father appeared just as the service was about to begin, slipping into a seat in the back row. He looked uncomfortable in his dark suit, his eyes fixed on the program in his hands, rather than on the casket at the front of the room. Janet wasn't with him, nor were Thomas and Abigail. I hadn't really expected them to come, but their absence was another small cut added to years of similar wounds. After the service, my father approached me briefly. "I am sorry for your loss," he said formally, as if offering condolences to a stranger. "Your mother was a good woman." I waited for more, for some acknowledgement of our shared grief or our connection, but he simply nodded awkwardly and walked away. That was it. Not even a hug at my mother's funeral. It shouldn't have surprised me, but somehow even after all these years it still hurt. The weeks following the funeral were a blur of paperwork arrangements and the strange emptiness that follows loss. Daniel took time off work to help me clear out my mother's apartment. We sorted through her belongings, deciding what to keep, what to donate, what to discard. It was during this process, as I was going through papers in her desk, that I found the box. It was nothing special to look at, just a plain cardboard box, sealed with packing tape that had yellowed with age. My name was written on the top in my mother's handwriting, along with the words, "When you're ready." I set it aside, focusing on the more immediate tasks of emptying the apartment, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night back at our hotel, I placed the box on the bed and stared at it. Part of me wanted to open it immediately, hungry for any connection to my mother. Another part feared what I might find inside. "You don't have to look at it now," Daniel said gently, sitting beside me. "You could wait until we're home when things aren't so raw." "I know." I replied, running my fingers along the edge of the box. But I also know I won't be able to think about anything else until I see what's inside. Daniel squeezed my hand. I will be right here with you, whatever it is. Taking a deep breath, I cut through the tape and opened the box. Inside were bundles of letters tied with faded ribbons, legal documents, old photographs, and what looked like medical records. I picked up one of the bundles of letters, recognizing my mother's handwriting on the envelopes. The letters were correspondence between my parents from before I was born. Their early exchanges were full of love and plans for the future, but as I read through them chronologically, I could see their relationship deteriorating. There were arguments about money, about my father's family's interference, and about a major disagreement that was never fully explained in the letters themselves. One letter from my father, dated a few months before my birth, contained a line that made my blood run cold. The DNA test confirms what I already knew. Now we need to discuss what happens next. I looked up at Daniel, confusion and hurt swirling inside me. DNA test? Was he not my father? Is that why he hated me all these years? The question had never occurred to me before. I had always assumed his rejection was about me, something inherently unlovable about me as a person. The possibility that he might not be my biological father opened a whole new realm of questions and potential answers. My mind raced with memories, trying to detect physical resemblances, or the lack thereof. I had always been told I had my mother's eyes and smile, but I had never seen much of myself in my father. Was that because there was no biological connection? Or simply because I had been looking for any explanation for his coldness? I continued sorting through the box, but found no definitive answer about the DNA test mentioned in the letter. There were more documents to go through, but exhaustion overwhelmed me, and Daniel gently suggested we continue the next day. Over the next few days, as we finished clearing out the apartment, I kept returning to the box, piecing together fragments of my parents' history. I found references to disagreements with my father's family, particularly his mother, who seemed to have strongly disapproved of my mother, for reasons that weren't clear from the letters alone. As we prepared to return to Seattle, I realized there was someone who might have answers. Grace Adams had been my mother's best friend since college. They had remained close even when life took them in different directions, and Grace had been a constant loving presence throughout my childhood. If anyone knew the truth about my parents' relationship and the circumstances of my birth, it would be her. I called Grace from the car as Daniel drove us home. I found a box of letters and documents, I explained after expressing my gratitude for her support during the funeral. There are things about my father, about their relationship, that I never knew. Would you be willing to talk to me about it? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Your mother wanted to protect you, Grace finally said, her voice heavy with what sounded like reluctance. She always said she would tell you herself when the time was right. She tried to. I told her, tears welling in my eyes. The day before she died, she started to tell me there was something I should know about my father, but we were interrupted, and then… I couldn't finish the sentence. Another pause, then Grace sighed. All right, I am flying back to Boston tomorrow, but I could meet you for coffee this evening if you are passing through Portland. We arranged to meet at a small cafe near Grace's home. Daniel offered to come with me, but I felt this was something I needed to do alone. I will wait in the car, he promised. Take as long as you need. The cafe was quiet when I arrived, just a few patrons scattered at tables, soft music playing in the background. Grace was already there, looking older than I remembered her, once dark hair, now completely silver. She stood to hug me, and I caught the familiar scent of the lavender perfume she had worn for as long as I could remember. You look so much like her, Grace said as we sat down. She would be proud of the woman you have become. We exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes, both of us perhaps delaying the real purpose of our meeting. Finally, I took a deep breath and asked the question that had been consuming me since finding the letters. Is William Harris my biological father? Grace looked surprised by my directness. Yes, he is. Was that in question? It was my turn to be surprised. There was a letter mentioning a DNA test. I thought maybe… Ah, Grace nodded in understanding. Yes, there was a DNA test, but not for the reason you're thinking. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup as if gathering strength from its warmth. Lydia, what I am about to tell you is something your mother wanted to protect you from. Are you sure you want to know? I need to understand, I said firmly. I have spent my entire life feeling unwanted by my father and his family. Whatever the truth is, it can't be worse than the stories I have been telling myself. Grace nodded, accepting my decision. Before you were born, your mother discovered she had a genetic condition, something that could potentially be passed down to her children. It wasn't life-threatening, but it would mean certain challenges. When she told your father, he insisted on a DNA test to confirm paternity before the baby was born, before you were born. But why? I asked, confused. If they were in a relationship, your father's family has a history of the same condition, Grace explained. The chances of a child inheriting it increase significantly when both parents are carriers. When the test confirmed he was the father, She paused, seeming to search for the right words. He wanted your mother to terminate the pregnancy. The words hit me like a physical blow. He wanted me to never exist. Grace reached across the table and took my hand. Your mother refused. She believed that whatever challenges you might face, your life would be valuable and beautiful. She was willing to raise you alone if necessary, but your father's family became involved. They had very strong religious beliefs about termination, so they pressured him to stay in the relationship at least until you were born. So he stayed out of obligation, I said, the pieces beginning to fall into place. And then you were born perfectly healthy, Grace said, a small smile forming. You didn't inherit the condition at all. But by then, the damage to your parents' relationship was done. Your father's family, especially his mother, had convinced themselves that your mother had somehow trapped him, that she had gotten pregnant intentionally to force him to stay with her. The truth was, they had planned to get married eventually, but the pregnancy was a surprise to both of them. I sat back in my chair trying to process what I was hearing. So all these years, all the coldness, all the rejection, it wasn't about you as a person, Grace confirmed gently. It was never about you, Lydia. It was about the circumstances of your birth, about old resentments and misunderstandings that hardened into something ugly over time. As I drove back to meet Daniel, Grace's revelations echoed in my mind. My father and his family had hated me not for who I was, but for the simple fact that I existed. The truth was both better and worse than I had imagined. Better because their rejection wasn't about some inherent flaw in me. Worse because how do you reconcile with people who wished you had never been born? For weeks after learning the truth, I carried it like a heavy stone in my chest, unsure what to do with this knowledge. Daniel listened patiently as I processed my feelings, ranging from rage to deep sadness to a strange kind of relief. My therapist, Dr. Winters, helped me work through the complex emotions that the revelation had triggered. What would you want to happen if you could have anything? She asked during one session. I thought about it carefully. I want them to acknowledge what they did, I finally said. Not just my father, but his whole family. I want them to admit that they treated me terribly for something that was never my fault. And I want to look them in the eye when they do it, so I can finally stop being the ghost in their family. Do you think confronting them would give you that? Dr. Winters asked. I don't know, I admitted. But I know that staying silent, pretending I don't know, would be letting them off the hook again. I have spent my whole life adjusting to their rejection, making myself smaller, blaming myself. I won't do it anymore. With Daniel's support and my therapist's guidance, I began planning how to approach my father. A letter seemed too easy to ignore. A phone call too easy to end. I needed to see his face when I confronted him with the truth. I decided to suggest meeting at a restaurant, a neutral location, where the public setting might help keep emotions in check. To my surprise, when I called and asked for a meeting, my father agreed readily, though he sounded confused by the request. Is everything all right, Lydia? He asked, an unusual note of concern in his voice. No, I said honestly. But I think this conversation is long overdue. Would Janet, Thomas, and Abigail be able to join us as well? There was a pause. I can ask them, he said cautiously. May I tell them what this is about? Just tell them I have something important to discuss with all of you, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Something about our family history. We arranged to meet the following Saturday at an upscale restaurant in Portland. I chose the location carefully, somewhere quiet enough for conversation, but public enough that it would discourage any extreme reactions. Daniel offered to come with me for support, but I decided this was something I needed to face alone. "I will drop you off and pick you up," he insisted. "And I will keep my phone on. If you need me for any reason, just text and I will be there in minutes." I spent the days leading up to the meeting preparing. I made copies of the most relevant documents from my mother's box, organizing them chronologically to tell the story they revealed. I rehearsed what I wanted to say, trying to find words that would express my hurt without devolving into accusations that could be easily dismissed. The day of the meeting arrived cold and clear. I dressed carefully in a simple black dress and the pearl necklace that had been my mother's, a subtle reminder of her presence with me. Daniel drove me to the restaurant, squeezing my hand before I got out of the car. "Remember, you have nothing to be ashamed of," he said. "Nothing to apologize for. This is about them, not you." My father and Janet were already seated when I arrived. Thomas and Abigail joined us moments later. They all looked varying degrees of uncomfortable, clearly unsure why I had called this family meeting after years of minimal contact. "Thank you for coming," I said as I took my seat, placing my folder of documents on the table beside me. "I appreciate you all taking the time." "Of course," my father replied stiffly. "You said it was important." I looked around at their faces. These people who were technically my family but had always made me feel like an outsider. Janet, still elegant at 60, her face carefully maintained, but her eyes cold. Thomas, now in his early 30s, successful in business from what I had heard, looking impatient to be elsewhere. Abigail, the baby of the family, now a young woman of 29, the only one who looked genuinely curious rather than defensive. "After my mother died," I began, my voice steadier than I had expected, "I found documents that helped me understand why our family has been the way it has been. Why I was always treated differently. Why I never felt welcome or wanted." My father shifted in his seat, his expression guarded. "Lydia, I don't think this is the appropriate venue for family grievances." "This isn't about grievances," I replied calmly. "This is about the truth, about understanding. Don't you think I deserve that much after all these years?" Before he could respond, I opened the folder and took out the first document, a copy of the letter mentioning the DNA test. I placed it on the table where they could all see it. "I know about the genetic condition. I know about the DNA test. I know you wanted my mother to terminate her pregnancy when you found out I might inherit the condition from both of you." The color drained from my father's face. Janet gasped softly. Thomas and Abigail exchanged confused glances. "That's not, I didn't," my father stammered, then stopped. He took a deep breath. "You weren't supposed to know about that." "Well, I do know," I said. "I know everything. How your family convinced themselves that my mother trapped you by getting pregnant. How you stayed in the relationship only because your family's religious beliefs wouldn't allow you to support a termination. How you all resented my very existence before I was even born." "It wasn't like that," Janet interjected, her voice sharp. "You don't understand the pressure William was under, the difficulty of the situation." "I understand perfectly," I countered. "What I don't understand is why you continued to punish me for it long after I was born. I was a child. I had no part in any of the adult decisions that were made before my birth." I placed more documents on the table, one by one. Medical records showing I hadn't inherited the condition after all. Letters between my parents showing the deterioration of their relationship. What I want to know is why. Why treat a child that way? What possible justification could you have? My father looked at the documents, then at me, his expression a mixture of shame and defiance. "I wanted what was best for everyone," he said finally. "Your mother refused to consider the potential consequences. She was willing to bring a child into the world who might suffer, might have a difficult life. I thought that was selfish." "And when I was born healthy?" I asked. "When it was clear I hadn't inherited the condition, why continue to reject me then?" He had no good answer for that. "It was complicated," he said weakly. "By then there was so much bad blood between your mother and me, between our families. So you punished me for it." I said, the hurt I had carried for decades evident in my voice despite my attempts to remain calm. All of you. You punished a child for existing, for being born against your wishes. Do you have any idea what that did to me? How it shaped every relationship I've ever had, how it made me question my own worth every single day. Thomas, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. You're being dramatic, he said dismissively. Nobody punished you. So what if Dad wasn't super involved? Lots of kids have distant fathers. It was more than distance, I replied, looking directly at him. It was active rejection. It was being seated at a separate table during Thanksgiving dinner. It was having my art portfolio destroyed with no consequences. It was being introduced as the girl who visits sometimes instead of my sister. It was 1,000 small cruelties that added up to one message: you are not wanted here. Abigail looked down at her hands, a flush spreading across her cheeks. I was just a kid, she said softly. I didn't understand. I just knew that Mom and Dad acted differently around you, so I did too. Children follow their parents' lead, I acknowledged. But you're adults now. You've been adults for a long time. At what point do you take responsibility for your own actions? Janet's expression hardened. The past should stay in the past, Lydia. What do you want from us now? An apology money. What is the point of dredging all this up after so many years? I looked at each of them in turn, these people who shared my blood, but had never shared their hearts. I wanted you to know, that I understand. It wasn't about me, about who I am as a person. It was about your own fears and resentments and prejudices. I wanted to stop carrying the weight of your rejection as if it were my fault. I stood up, gathering the documents back into the folder. I don't hate you, I said, surprising even myself with the truth of it. I spent too many years letting your actions dictate my feelings. I'm done with that now. My father looked up at me, and for a moment I thought I saw genuine regret in his eyes. Lydia, he began, then stopped. I'm sorry things weren't different. It wasn't a real apology. It accepted no responsibility, acknowledged no wrongdoing. It was just another way of saying, that's just how it was, without admitting his role in making it that way. So am I replied. Goodbye. As I walked out of the restaurant, I felt both heavy with the weight of all that had been said and somehow lighter for having finally said it. The family I had longed for all my life didn't exist and never had. But that knowledge, painful as it was also freeing. Daniel was waiting in the car just as he had promised. One look at my face told him everything he needed to know. He simply opened his arms and I fell into them, releasing tears I hadn't allowed myself to shed in the restaurant. Let's go home, he said softly when my tears subsided. Our real home with people who actually love you. As we drove away, I didn't look back at the restaurant. I didn't need to. For the first time in my life, I was moving forward without the ghost of my father's rejection following behind me. The weeks following the confrontation with my father and his family were difficult. I cycled through anger, grief, and a strange sense of emptiness. Having finally spoken my truth, having finally confronted the people who had caused me so much pain, I found myself unsure what to do with the space that pain had occupied for so long. I withdrew from friends and work, spending days in bed, staring at the ceiling. Daniel would bring me tea and sit beside me, not pushing me to talk or get up, just being present. Luna, our rescue dog, seemed to sense my distress and barely left my side, her warm body pressed against me as if trying to absorb some of my sadness. I thought I would feel better, I told Dr. Winters during a therapy session. I thought confronting them would be this cathartic moment where everything changed, but I feel worse in some ways. What you're experiencing is normal, she assured me. You're grieving not just the relationship you had with your father, but the relationship you never had, and now know you never will. That's a profound loss. So what do I do now? I asked, feeling lost. You continue living, she said simply. You continue building a life filled with people who value you. You continue creating beauty through your art. And gradually you'll find that the space once filled with pain becomes filled with other things, better things. Her words stayed with me. The idea that I could fill the empty spaces with things of my own choosing was powerful. Slowly, I began to emerge from my depression. I started by taking Luna for longer walks, finding solace in the rhythm of our steps and the simple joy she took in exploring the world. I began cooking again, inviting friends over for dinner, reconnecting with the support network I had withdrawn from. One evening, as I was sorting through old photographs for a personal project, I came across an image I had taken years ago during college, a self-portrait that captured both vulnerability and strength. It sparked something in me, an idea for a series exploring family rejection and ultimately self-acceptance. I began working on the series in my home studio, using photography, mixed media, and personal artifacts to create pieces that told my story without words. The process was therapeutic, allowing me to channel my pain into creativity. As the collection grew, Daniel suggested I consider showing it. "These are powerful, Lydia," he said, looking at the pieces I had arranged on the walls of our spare room. "They might help other people who have experienced similar rejection." The thought was intimidating, making myself that vulnerable to strangers, but also compelling. If my experience could help even one person feel less alone in their pain, wouldn't that transform my suffering into something meaningful? While I was working on my art series, I received an unexpected email from my maternal grandmother asking if I would be interested in attending a family reunion that summer. I had always been closer to my mother's family than my father's, but distance and my mother's illness had created some separation over the years. The reunion was held at my great-aunt's farm in Oregon, a sprawling property with gardens, orchards, and a pond perfect for swimming on hot summer days. I arrived feeling nervous, unsure of my place in this extended family after years of limited contact. I needn't have worried. My mother's relatives welcomed me with open arms, eager to reconnect, to share stories about her, to learn about my life. "You have your mother's spirit," my grandmother told me as we sat on the porch swing watching fireflies appear in the twilight. "Her kindness, her resilience. She would be so proud of the woman you've become." Those words, that acceptance, meant more to me than she could know. Here was family that valued me, that saw me as a continuation of someone they had loved, rather than an unwelcome reminder of old resentments. I left the reunion with promises to stay in touch, to visit more often, to not let these connections fade again. Back in Seattle, I joined a support group for people with difficult family relationships. Listening to others share stories of rejection, estrangement, and their journeys toward healing helped me feel less alone. Some had found reconciliation with their families, others had created boundaries that allowed for limited but manageable contact, and some, like me, were learning to accept that some relationships cannot be fixed, and that's okay. "The hardest part," said Megan, a woman in her 40s who had been estranged from her mother for over a decade, "is letting go of the fantasy. We all have this idea of what family should be, and letting go of that, accepting what is instead of what should be, that's the real work." Her words resonated deeply. I had spent so many years trying to earn my father's love, trying to be worthy of a family that had decided before I was even born that they didn't want me. The fantasy of someday being truly accepted by them had been a silent, persistent hope that had shaped so much of my life. As I continued my healing journey, I made a conscious decision not to let hatred take root where love should have been. I couldn't force my father or his family to love me, but I could choose not to let their failure define me or determine my capacity for joy. Their behavior came from fear, Dr. Winters reminded me. Fear of a genetic condition, fear of judgment from their community, fear of disruption to their comfortable lives. Fear makes people small, makes them cruel sometimes. Understanding that doesn't excuse what they did, but it might help you carry it differently. I thought about that a lot, about how fear can warp people's actions and perceptions. I thought about how my father's family had constructed a narrative about my mother, about me, that allowed them to justify their treatment of us. I wondered if in their private moments, any of them ever questioned that narrative, ever felt remorse for the pain they had caused. 3 months after our confrontation at the restaurant, I received an unexpected email from Abigail, my half-sister. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she wrote, "about taking responsibility for my own actions. I was wondering if you would be willing to meet for coffee sometime. I'd like to understand better to hear your perspective. I was surprised by the request and unsure how to respond. Part of me was wary, suspicious of her motives, afraid of opening myself up to more rejection. But another part remembered her expression during our confrontation, the shame that had colored her cheeks when I described how she had treated me as a child. After discussing it with Daniel and Dr. Winters, I decided to meet her. We arranged to meet at a small cafe halfway between our homes. I arrived early, choosing a table near the window where I could see her approach, giving myself the option to leave if I felt overwhelmed. Abigail arrived precisely on time, looking nervous but determined. She was dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, her dark hair, so like our father's, pulled back in a simple ponytail. We ordered coffee and for several minutes engaged in awkward small talk about the weather, our jobs, neutral topics that wouldn't reveal too much. Finally, Abigail set down her cup and looked at me directly. "I owe you an apology," she said. "A real one, not like what Dad gave you. I was horrible to you when we were kids, and even though I was young, I knew what I was doing. I knew it hurt you, and I did it anyway." Her honesty surprised me. "Why?" I asked simply. She sighed. "Because it was easier. Because it made me feel like I belonged, like I was on the inside of something instead of the outside, because I was a coward." We talked for over 2 hours. Abigail shared her perspective on growing up in our father's house, the pressure to conform, to never question, to maintain the family narrative at all costs. She explained how she had begun to question things in her 20s, especially after she started working as a counselor with troubled teens, and saw how family dynamics can shape a child's entire sense of self. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said as our meeting was ending. "I wouldn't expect that. I just wanted you to know that I see it now, what we did to you. And I'm sorry." I didn't know if Abigail and I would ever have a real sisterly relationship. But that coffee meeting opened a small door between us, a tentative bridge across years of pain and separation. We agreed to keep in touch, to perhaps meet again in the future with no pressure or expectations. As for my father and Janet, I decided to establish firm boundaries while leaving the possibility of change open. I sent my father an email explaining that I wasn't interested in a relationship that didn't acknowledge the past and make real efforts to change in the present. "If you ever want to have an honest conversation about what happened and how we might move forward, I'm willing to listen," I wrote. "But I won't pretend anymore, and I won't accept less than I deserve." He never responded directly to that email, but a month later he sent a brief message with a link to information about the genetic condition that had been at the root of so much pain. "Thought you might want this for your medical records," he wrote. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small acknowledgement that he recognized I had a right to know about my own medical history. As the months passed, I found myself thinking less about my father's rejection and more about the life I was building with Daniel. We had started discussing having children of our own, a prospect that both excited and terrified me given my family history. "What if I don't know how to be a good parent?" I asked Daniel one night as we lay in bed, the moonlight casting shadows across our room. "What if I carry forward all the damage from my own childhood?" Daniel propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at me with those thoughtful eyes that had first drawn me to him. "You already know what not to do," he said. "You know how it feels to be rejected, so you'll never do that to our child. And you have so much love to give Lydia. I see it every day in how you care for me, for Luna, for your friends. You'll be an amazing mother." His faith in me was touching, but I still had doubts. I decided to focus on healing as much as possible before bringing a child into the world, continuing with therapy, and actively working on replacing old negative thought patterns with healthier ones. My art series about family and rejection was eventually exhibited at a small gallery in Seattle. The opening night was terrifying and exhilarating. Strangers walked through the exhibition looking at the most vulnerable parts of my soul rendered visible. Some were moved to tears, others shared their own stories of family pain, and still others simply sat in silence before the pieces that spoke most strongly to them. A local art critic wrote that the series transforms personal pain into universal truth, asking us all to consider how rejection shapes us and how we can reshape ourselves in its aftermath. The validation was nice, but the real value was in the conversations the exhibition sparked, the connections it created between people who had experienced similar journeys. As I stood in the gallery on the final night of the exhibition watching people engage with my work, I felt a profound sense of peace. The truth about why my father and his family hated me was painful, but knowing it had set me free in ways I hadn't anticipated. No longer did I have to wonder what was wrong with me, what fundamental flaw made me unlovable in their eyes. Now I understood that their rejection had never been about me at all, but about their own fears and failures. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't make my father love me or erase the years of feeling unwanted and out of place. But I could choose how I carried that experience forward, how I let it shape me. I could choose to break the cycle to create a family based on acceptance and love rather than fear and judgment. As Daniel and I left the gallery that night hand in hand under a sky full of stars, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel after confronting such painful truths: hope. Hope for the future, for the family we would create together, for the person I was becoming day by day as I shed the weight of rejection and embraced my own worth. The truth hadn't magically fixed everything, hadn't erased the scars of a lifetime of rejection. But it had given me something precious, the freedom to write my own story, moving forward unbound by the narratives others had created about me. And in that freedom, I found healing. Have you ever discovered a painful family secret that changed how you viewed your childhood? I would love to hear your experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that rejection is not a reflection of their worth. Thank you for listening to my story. Remember, sometimes knowing the truth, no matter how painful, is the first step toward real healing.